The thermostat read 40 degrees, but the walls were bleeding. It wasn't water seeping through the plaster, but a thick, sour-smelling condensation. Arthur pressed his bare hand against the living room wall. It was warm. Too warm. Inside their eco-friendly dream home, something was alive, and the blizzard had just begun. It started as most disasters do, with the absolute certainty of a good intention. Arthur and Claire Hayes had spent the better part of a decade trapped in the concrete arteries of downtown Chicago. Arthur, a 42-year-old software architect, had watched his hairline recede and his blood pressure climb with every passing fiscal quarter. Claire, a 39-year-old high school biology teacher, spent her days lecturing students about ecosystems she had only ever seen in documentaries. When Arthur's startup was acquired in the spring of 2022, the buyout was modest, but enough to fund an escape. They bought 20 acres of untamed, breathtaking land, 15 lions outside of Telluride, Colorado. The property sat at an elevation of 8,500 feet, nestled in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains. It was to be their sanctuary, a fully off-grid, sustainable homestead built with their own hands. Arthur's research into sustainable architecture quickly led him down the rabbit hole of alternative building methods. He bypassed traditional fiberglass and spray foam. Captivated instead by the romance of straw bale construction, the method was ancient, environmentally flawless, and promised an insulation R-value that rivaled the best modern materials. But building in the remote Rockies came with a brutal, ticking clock. By early September, the framing was up, but the global supply chain was still reeling from logistical nightmares. The specialized moisture-free wheat straw bales Arthur had ordered from a supplier in Kansas were indefinitely delayed. The first frost of the season was weeks away, and without walls, the winter would destroy the exposed timber framing. Desperate, Arthur drove into town and struck a deal with a local rancher named Bill Clemens. Bill had just finished his final harvest and had hundreds of bales sitting in his barn. "I need 400 bales, Bill, by tomorrow," Arthur had pleaded, standing in the dusty dimness of the rancher's barn. Bill had scratched his chin, looking at the city man with a mix of pity and skepticism. "I got alfalfa hay, Art. It's dense, it's dry, but it's cattle feed. It ain't building material. It's tightly bound and it's dry," Arthur reasoned, doing the mental math. "Once it's sealed behind lime plaster, it won't matter if it's wheat stalks or alfalfa. Insulation is just trapped air." When the flatbed trucks arrived at the build site the next morning, David Garrison, the seasoned local contractor Arthur had hired to oversee the structural framing, took one look at the green-tinged bales and shook his head. "Hay is for horses, Arthur. Straw is for houses," David warned, pulling a handful of the dried green vegetation from a bale. "Look at this. There are seed heads in here. There's nitrogen. Straw is dead, hollow carbon. This hay, it's still full of food. If this gets even a fraction of moisture in it, you aren't building a wall. You're building a compost pile." "It won't get wet," Arthur insisted, his pride flaring. He was exhausted. His bank account was draining faster than anticipated, and the mountain wind was already carrying the bite of winter. "We're doing 3 coats of hydraulic lime plaster on the exterior. It's vapor permeable, but waterproof. It's going to be a fortress." Claire had stood quietly by the mixer, her arms coated in white line dust. As a biologist, she understood David's warning perfectly. Organic matter plus moisture equals decomposition. But looking at Arthur's desperate, bloodshot eyes, she swallowed her doubts. They were so close. For the next 3 weeks, they worked like machines. They stacked the heavy 70-pound hay bales like giant organic Lego bricks between the timber frames. They drove wooden stakes down through the courses to pin them together, compressing the walls into massive 2-foot-thick barriers against the world. Then came the plastering, a grueling, messy process that left their hands blistered and their shoulders screaming. By late October, the Hayes homestead was complete. It was undeniably beautiful. The thick, slightly undulating white walls gave the house a cozy Mediterranean feel. completely at odds with the jagged snow-capped peaks looming outside the massive triple-pane windows. The deep windowsills became shelves for Claire's dry-resistant plants. When November arrived, bringing the first standard dustings of snow, the house performed exactly as the internet forums had promised. The heavy walls absorbed the heat from the cast-iron wood stove during the day and radiated it back into the living space at night. They were using a fraction of the firewood their neighbors used. The house was a quiet, warm cocoon. Arthur felt completely vindicated. He started an Instagram account, posting pictures of his glowing wood stove against the rustic white plaster, using hashtags like #EcoLiving and #OffGrid Architect. They poured glasses of wine and toasted to their brilliance, completely oblivious to the microscopic, silent catastrophe that was already taking root just millimeters beneath the beautiful white plaster of their living room walls. The National Weather Service upgraded the alert from a watch to a warning on the morning of January 12th. By noon, the local news stations out of Denver were using phrases like historic atmospheric river and once-in-a-generation polar vortex. The storm didn't begin with snow. It began as a meteorological freak accident, a massive front of warm, humid air sweeping up from the Gulf of Mexico, colliding violently with a super-chilled Arctic mass descending from Canada right over the San Juan Range. It started as a torrential, freezing rain. For 12 agonizing hours, water poured from the sky, instantly freezing upon contact with the sub-zero landscape. The Hayes homestead was coated in a 2-inch thick shell of solid, clear ice. Arthur stood by the window watching the pine trees snap under the sheer weight of the ice, sounding like distant rifle shots echoing through the valley. "The house is holding up perfectly," he told Claire, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. What Arthur couldn't see was the physics of the ice storm ravaging his shortcut. Hydraulic lime plaster is remarkably durable, but it requires the ability to expand and contract. Trapped beneath thousands of pounds of rigid, expanding ice, the exterior plaster began to suffer microscopic fractures. Hairline cracks spiderwebbed across the north and west-facing walls. Then the true blizzard hit. The temperature plummeted from 20 degrees to -25 in a matter of hours. The freezing rain turned into heavy, blinding whiteout snow driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. Within 36 hours, 3 feet of snow had piled up, burying the ground-mounted solar panels and plunging the house into darkness. "Generator time," Arthur announced, trying to sound cheerful. He bundled up, fought his way through the waist-deep drifts to the outbuilding, and fired up the 10-kilowatt diesel backup. The lights flickered back on. But as the third day of the storm dragged into the fourth, a creeping, unnatural cold began to settle into the house. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of an open window. It was a heavy, damp chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. Claire was the first to notice the smell. She was sitting on the sofa, huddled under 2 wool blankets, trying to read by the light of a lamp. She paused, sniffing the air. "Art? Did you bring the trash inside?" Arthur furiously feeding split logs into the roaring wood stove, white soot from his forehead. "No." "Why?" "It smells sweet, sweet. Sickly sweet, like a barn that hasn't been mucked out." "Not go. Sadum Baltim. Sha." Arthur frowned, walking over to her side of the room. He smelled it too. A distinct heavy odor of ammonia and rotting vegetation. It was faint, but it hung in the air, thick and claustrophobic. "It's probably just the plumbing vent getting frozen over," Arthur rationalized, though his stomach gave a sudden, uneasy lurch. "I'll try to clear the roof pipe tomorrow if the wind dies down." But the wind didn't die down. The temperature outside hit -32. The wood stove was burning at maximum capacity, the cast iron glowing cherry red, yet the thermometer on the living room wall stubbornly refused to climb above 45 degrees. The thermal mass of the house had completely failed. The nightmare was unfolding entirely out of sight. The hairline cracks in the exterior plaster had allowed the freezing rain to penetrate the shell before turning to snow. The moisture had wickered directly into the densely packed alfalfa hay. At the same time, the intense dry heat radiating from the indoor wood stove pushed outward through the interior plaster. Somewhere in the middle of that 2-foot-thick wall, the freezing exterior moisture met the hot interior air, creating a catastrophic dew point. The hay was soaking wet, and as David Garrison had warned months ago, alfalfa is not hollow carbon. It is food. It is packed with nitrogen and proteins. Locked inside a thick, oxygen-deprived space, soaking wet and heated by the ambient warmth of the indoor stove, the 400 bales of hay did exactly what biology dictated. They began to ferment. They began to compost. On the night of the 5th day, the situation escalated from uncomfortable to terrifying. Claire woke up to a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the howling wind outside. It was a frantic, scrabbling noise. Scratch, squeak, wrestle. It was coming from everywhere. She shook Arthur awake. "Art! Listen." Arthur sat up, the freezing air of the bedroom biting his lungs. The house was pitch black. To save fuel, they had turned off the generator at midnight. The scratching sound was immense, surrounding them like stereophonic static. "Mice," Arthur whispered, horrified. The extreme cold outside had driven the local wildlife to absolute desperation. But they weren't just seeking the ambient warmth of the house. They possessed an acute sense of smell. To a starving field mouse in a blizzard, the scent of fermenting, nutrient-rich alfalfa hay was a dinner bell ringing across the mountainside. They had chewed through the weakened exterior plaster where the ice had cracked it, tunneling directly into the insulation. Arthur grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and clicked it on. He walked barefoot into the hallway, the hardwood floor like a slab of ice beneath his feet. He shone the beam against the wall. That was when he saw the wall, sweating. Thick yellow-brown beads of moisture were forming on the pristine white plaster, running down in slow, dirty tear tracks toward the baseboards. The sickly sweet smell of ammonia and rot was now overpowering, burning the back of his throat. Trembling, Arthur stepped closer and pressed his palm flat against the plaster. The ambient temperature in the hallway was 40 degrees. The wall beneath his hand was feverishly hot. "Claire," Arthur croaked, staring at his hand, which was now coated in a sticky, sour-smelling residue. "The walls, they're cooking, but because of the composting process, the hay inside the walls was generating its own immense thermal energy. But it was wet, heat-rotting heat. It had completely destroyed the R-value of the insulation, meaning the cold from outside was slicing right through the timber framing, while the rotting mass inside the walls pumped toxic, humid air into the living space. Crack! A sound like a gunshot made them both jump. In the living room, a vertical fissure 3 feet long had suddenly split down the center of the main wall. The sheer pressure of the swelling, fermenting hay, combined with the extreme temperature differential, had snapped the lime plaster right off the wooden lathe. Arthur and Claire stood frozen in the beam of the flashlight, watching in horror as a clump of steaming, blackened, rotting hay bulged out of the fresh crack. As they watched, a pair of tiny, frantic black eyes peered out from the steaming rot, followed by a squeak. Then the diesel generator outside coughed, sputtered, and died. The fuel line had frozen solid. They were trapped in the dark 30 miles from help, freezing to death inside a house that was rotting alive. The silence that followed the generator's death was absolute, broken only by the relentless howling of the blizzard outside and the horrific, wet, tearing sounds emanating from inside their walls. Arthur stared at the black, steaming fissure in the plaster. The flashlight beam trembled in his grip. The sickening realization washed over him. Their eco-friendly fortress had become a Trojan horse, harboring a biological nightmare. "Get your winter gear on," Arthur instructed, his voice eerily calm, a thin veneer over rising panic. "Everything, base layers, snow pants, parkas. Now." Claire didn't argue. She fumbled through the heavy oak dresser in the pitch black, her breath pluming in the flashlight's beam. The ambient temperature in the house was plummeting with terrifying speed. Without the generator to run the fan that circulated the wood stove's heat, the warmth was pooling uselessly around the cast iron while the extremities of the house plunged toward zero. "I have to check the generator," Arthur said, zipping up his north-faced parka and pulling a heavy wool balaclava over his head. "If the fuel line is just gelled, maybe I can wrap it in a heated blanket." "Wait, no power," he cursed, rubbing his temples. "I'll try to clear the intake. Maybe wrap it in insulation." He grabbed a crowbar from the mudroom and forced the heavy front door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of kinetic energy and blinding white crystals. The cold was so absolute it instantly seared his lungs and froze the moisture on his eyelashes. Arthur waded into the waist-deep snow, fighting his way toward the outbuilding 10 yards away. It took him 5 minutes of agonizing effort just to reach the generator enclosure. He pried the metal housing open. The diesel fuel filter had shattered. Extreme cold, combined with the wind chill factor dropping to -50, had turned the fuel into a thick, useless slush that expanded and cracked the casing. The machine was dead until the spring thaw. Defeated and shivering violently, Arthur fought his way back inside, throwing his weight against the front door to force it shut against the wind. "It's dead," he gasped, collapsing onto the mudroom floor, his boots coated in ice. "We have no power." Claire was standing in the center of the living room, illuminated by the soft, flickering orange glow of the wood stove. She held a battery-powered weather radio in one hand and a fire poker in the other. "Art," she said, her voice trembling. The mice. The invasion had begun in earnest. Driven by the freezing temperatures and lured by the massive food source, the rodents were breaching the interior plaster. Small dark shades darted across the hardwood floor, fleeing the unbearable heat of the composting hay inside the walls and seeking refuge in the living space. "Leave them," Arthur said, stripping off his frozen outer gloves. "They aren't our biggest problem right now." "Not the fuck." He walked over to the wood stove and loaded it with 3 thick logs of dense hickory, opening the damper to let it roar. But even standing 3 feet away, his back remained freezing. The house was hemorrhaging heat. The wet, rotting walls possessed negative insulation value, actively pulling the warmth out of the room. Claire, drawing on her biology background, was staring at the bulging crack in the wall with wide, terrified eyes. "Arthur, do you know what happens when organic matter decomposes anaerobically in a confined space?" "It rots," Arthur said grimly. "It smells like hell. It generates heat," Claire corrected, stepping closer to him, her eyes locked on the steaming fissure. "A lot of heat, and bacteria produce gases. Methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia. That's what we're smelling. But more importantly, the core temperature of a wet, densely packed hay bale can easily reach 150 degrees during decomposition." Arthur frowned, the implication taking a moment to penetrate his exhausted brain. "Okay, so the walls are hot. At least it's heat." "No, art." "You don't understand," Claire said, grabbing his arm. "If the core temperature hits 170 degrees in the presence of trapped oxygen, it causes spontaneous combustion. Barns burn down every year from wet hay. The walls aren't just rotting. They're slowly turning into an incendiary bomb." Arthur felt his stomach drop. He walked over to the crack and held his bare hand near the exposed, blackened hay. The heat radiating from it was intense, like an open oven door. It was moist and ungodly hot. "We need a microclimate," Arthur decided, his survival instincts finally overriding his denial. "We can't heat the house, and we can't let the toxic gases fill the space." They sprang into action. Dragging their 4-season camping tent up from the basement, they pitched it directly in the center of the living room, mere feet from the wood stove. They threw all their heavy down sleeping bags, thermal foil blankets, and winter clothing inside. Next, Arthur grabbed a roll of heavy-duty Gorilla tape and thick plastic drop cloths left over from the construction. Working feverishly by the light of their headlamps, they taped the plastic sheets over the main entryways to the living room, sealing off the bedrooms, the kitchen, and the bathrooms. They were quarantining themselves in a single room. Finally, Arthur took the tape and sealed the massive crack in the plaster as best as he could, trying to track the rotting stench and the frantic mice behind the plastic. They crawled into the tent, zipping the nylon doors shut, creating a small insulated bubble heated by the nearby stove. Huddled together in their sleeping bags, wearing hats and gloves, they listened to the terrifying symphony of their dying house. The radio crackled on the floor of the tent. Telluride County Dispatch was broadcasting emergency updates. An automated voice read a statement from Sheriff Boyd Miller. All county roads remain impassable. Snowplows have been pulled due to zero visibility. Residents are ordered to shelter in place. Search and rescue operations are suspended until the storm breaks. Repeat, emergency services cannot reach you at this time. They are completely alone. Day 5 bled into Day 6. They survived on protein bars and melted snow boiled in a pot on top of the cast iron stove. The air inside the living room grew steadily worse. Despite the plastic sheeting, the heavy, suffocating odor of ammonia and rotting vegetation permeated everything. Arthur had to periodically crack a window to let in the freezing -20-degree air just to clear their lungs, trading precious heat for breathable oxygen. Every few hours, the plaster would groan and pop. The walls were physically expanding as the wet hay swelled and the bacterial activity peaked. By the afternoon of the 6th day, the smell inside the room shifted. Claire sat up in her sleeping bag, sniffing the air. The sickly sweet stench of ammonia had changed. It was sharper now. Acrid. Art, she whispered. Arthur unzipped the tent and stepped out. The temperature in the living room was 35 degrees, but the air was hazy. A thin, bluish mist hung near the ceiling. It wasn't steam. It was smoke. Arthur sprinted to the west wall. The plastic drop cloth he had taped over the fissure was melting. The edges of the plastic were curling inward, turning a brittle, scorched brown. He ripped the plastic away, coughing violently as a thick plume of gray smoke billowed into his face. The hay inside the wall was no longer damp and rotting. It was charred black, and deep within the cavity a dull, angry orange ember glowed. "It's burning," Arthur screamed, panic finally shattering his control. "Claire, it's combusting." The irony was sickening. Outside, the world was frozen solid in a historic blizzard. Inside, the house was catching fire from its own insulation. "Water! Get water!" Claire yelled, scrambling out of the tent and grabbing the pot of melted snow from the stove. She threw the lukewarm water into the crack. A massive hiss erupted, accompanied by a blinding cloud of foul-smelling steam and ash, but the orange glow deep inside the wall only dimmed for a second before flaring back up. "It's not enough," Arthur coughed, his eyes watering profusely from the toxic smoke. "The first and truly the latest. The water isn't penetrating, it's traveling up the wall cavity." He looked around wildly. If the fire reached the dry timber framing of the roof, the entire house would go up like a tinderbox. They would be forced out into a deadly blizzard with no shelter, a guaranteed death sentence within hours. "We have to open the wall," Arthur realized, his voice trembling. "We have to gut it. Now." He ran to the mudroom and retrieved a heavy, long-handled felling axe. "Stand back," he ordered Claire. Arthur swung the axe with all his might. The heavy steel blade smashed into the beautiful hand-troweled lime plaster. The wall shattered like a porcelain plate, raining chunks of white debris across the hardwood floor. He swung again and again, hacking a massive 4-foot-wide hole in his own living room wall. With every strike, more smoke poured out, filling the room with an unbreathable, blinding smog. When the plaster finally fell away, the true horror was revealed. The heavy timber studs were scorched black, and the bales of hay were a smoldering, compressed mass of slow-burning fuel. Hundreds of dead and dying mice spilled out onto the floor, casualties of the heat and toxic gases. The snow, Arthur yelled over the roaring wind outside. Open the window. We have to shovel the snow inside. Claire ran to the massive triple-pane window adjacent to the burning wall. She unlocked it and shoved. It was frozen shut. Arthur dropped the axe, grabbed the fire poker, and smashed the butt of the iron rod against the window frame, shattering the ice seal. They pushed the window open. A hurricane of sub-zero wind and snow blasted into the living room, instantly dropping the temperature to -10. Using a plastic snow shovel from the mudroom, Arthur began frantically shoveling the fresh snow from the windowsill directly into the gaping, smoldering wound in the wall. He shoveled like a madman, burying the burning hay under mounds of freezing white powder. The collision of the -30-degree snow with the 170-degree burning compost created a violent chemical reaction. The living room filled with a dense, suffocating fog of steam, ash, and smoke. Claire grabbed the axe and used the handle to violently stab into the bales, breaking up the dense, smoldering core so the melting snow could penetrate the center. For 45 minutes they fought a desperate, brutal war against their own house. They hacked, shoveled, and suffocated the smoldering mass until their muscles screamed and their lungs burned. The living room was completely destroyed, covered in shattered plaster, black ash, dead rodents, and melting snow. Eventually, the orange glow faded, the smoke thinned, replaced by the freezing, biting wind howling through the open window. Arthur collapsed against the sofa, his chest heaving, his face covered in black soot and sweat that was rapidly freezing in the sub-zero air. Claire slid down the wall next to him, dropping the axe. The fire was out, but a 10-foot section of their heavily insulated wall was completely gone, exposing the interior of the house directly to the blizzard. "Grab the sleeping bags," Arthur wheezed, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We have to get in the tent. Close the window. Now." They managed to force the window shut, but the cold was already victorious. They crawled into their tent, zipping themselves in tight. They huddled together, shivering so violently their teeth cracked together. The house was dead. It was just a matter of how long they could survive the freezing temperatures inside their nylon bubble. They lay there for 14 hours. The storm raged through the night, but by dawn of the 7th day the howling wind finally began to taper off. A weak, pale winter sun crested the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains, casting a brilliant, blinding light across a buried world. At 10 a.m., a sound cut through the silence. It was mechanical, high-pitched, a two-stroke engine. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He unzipped the tent with stiff, frost-bitten fingers. The roar grew louder. Through the frosted glass of the remaining windows, he saw 2 bright yellow snowmobiles cresting the massive drifts on their driveway. Arthur stumbled out of the tent, tripped over a pile of frozen, charred hay, and threw open the front door. "Hey!" he screamed, his voice cracking. We're here." The lead snowmobile cut its engine. A man in a heavy red search and rescue parka stepped off, pulling down his face mask. It was David Garrison, their contractor. Behind him, local Telluride deputy Mike Tremblay was already unstrapping emergency medical kits from his sled. David looked at Arthur, taking in the soot-stained face, the hollow eyes, and the catastrophic damage visible through the front door, the shattered plaster, the scorched timbers, the frozen mounds of hay. David didn't say, "I told you so." He just jogged forward and grabbed Arthur by the shoulder. "Let's get you 2 out of here," David said quietly. "The county plow is waiting at the highway." As Arthur and Claire strapped on helmets and climbed onto the backs of the snowmobiles, Arthur looked back at the house one last time. The pristine Mediterranean-style plaster was cracked and stained brown with toxic runoff. A massive jagged hole exposed the charred, rotting guts of the structure. His eco-friendly dream had become a monument to arrogance. He had tried to outsmart nature with a shortcut, and nature, in its infinite, brutal wisdom, had nearly buried them in it. If this story made your heart race and taught you a terrifying lesson about respecting nature's brutal realities, don't leave without engaging. Hit that like button, share this incredible survival story with anyone who loves off-grid living, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life, adrenaline-pumping survival documentaries. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Stay safe, stay prepared, and see you in the next one.